All right, so what we're going to talk about today is the various codes of ethics that are most influential in the modern history of engineering and engineering associations. So a code of ethics is different from a theory of ethics, and that in that a theory of ethics is really something that goes on within the realm of philosophy and moral philosophy, and in terms of trying to figure out how we get the basis for any ethical judgment from the fundamentals. A code of ethics, in contrast, is just you take the boiled down wisdom of people practicing some sort of job. So, for example, doctors or nurses, and they've had experience over the course of years and deciding what to do the right thing in real situations. And you get this wisdom and you wrap it up and you put it in, tie it together, put a bow on it, and that's your code of ethics, where you boil down the already existing wisdom along with the application of various ethical theories. So it's a guide to decision making within a given profession, and so we have some of those for engineering. We have fewer of those for computer science, and I'll discuss that. You codify the central moral commitments of the profession. These are not legal documents, though they may have relevance legally, depending on the situation, and they're definitely subject to revision. And what we're going to talk about today is mostly about how the history of some of these codes for engineering came about in the background. And they've been revised many times in many substantial ways. So this is a little overview from 1877 to 1954 of the beginnings of this sort of consideration of how we could create codes of ethics for engineers. And the reason for the creation of these codes was largely that there were significant accidents happening, significant wrongdoing, lying to the public, and various cases. And we had bridges collapsing in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century. You had cases of mass deception or war profiteering. And so they were developing these codes alongside those sorts of events. So if we go way back to 1877, there had been multiple disasters involving bridges, especially in England. And in America, looking at this, the American Society of Civil Engineers, ASCE, the secretary drafted a document for approval, saying things like, a civil engineer in the practice of his profession is sometimes restrained or overruled by his employers in matters involving serious risk to property and life, which he only, as an engineer, should determine. Whence he must either discharge its duties in a manner contrary to his best judgment or resign his position. So either he has to do his best to do the right thing, or he needs to resign, is what Leverich is saying. Resolved that in the opinion of the American Society of Civil Engineers, it is unprofessional for a civil engineer to continue to discharge his duties when so restrained or overruled. So if you're overruled, it's unethical, unprofessional for you to continue working. And this is a rule that seems like it might be reasonably obvious to some people, but it encountered a lot of resistance. This ethics resolution was rejected, and the board adopted a resolution saying it was inexpedient for this society to instruct its members as to their duties in private professional matters. Notice this term, private professional matters. This is being applied to whether a bridge, say, is safe or unsafe for the public to use. Doesn't seem very private to me, right? 1907 to 1912, the forerunner to the IEEE, Institute for Electronics and Electrical and Electronics Engineers. This is the Institute for American Electrical Engineering, before electronics existed. They drafted a code of ethics, which was approved by the organization in 1912. This is shortly after the Titanic accident. It says the engineer is personally responsible for the character of the enterprises with which he is associated professionally. Okay, this is a good start. Okay, and this is approved, and it's well over 100 years ago now, when what became the IEEE started this endeavor. You can see a copy of it on the right-hand side, a portion of the Code of Ethics. In 1914, the ASCE, American Society for Civil Engineers, approved its first Code of Ethics. And this Code of Ethics was very focused on duties toward your employer and duties toward your client. So the engineer has to follow through on duties toward his or her bosses, and the engineer has to follow through on duties to the clients, the people who are being served, so they don't dupe their clients or take their clients' money under false pretenses. But what you don't see here is duties toward the public, which was, if we look back in 1877, this was what Leverich, already 50 years ago now, had been focusing on. So the first item in this code, which you'll see often, but as a later item in some of the later codes that we'll look at. So you can see here that they say that it shall be considered unprofessional and inconsistent with honorable, dignified bearing for any member of the society to act for his clients in professional manners otherwise than as a faithful agent or trustee. So the rule here is you have to be a faithful agent and trustee. Also says that it's unprofessional to attempt to injure falsely or maliciously the professional reputation, prospects of another engineer, and to attempt to supplant another engineer after definite steps have been taken toward his employment. So you don't undercut your fellow engineers who perhaps work for different companies or independently. And then in 4 through 6 here, we see a set of items on the code that are a little stranger and don't obviously benefit the consumer in any way. So, for example, 6, it's forbidden to advertise in self-laudatory language. You're not allowed to say that you're good at what you do publicly. This remained on most of these codes of ethics until the 70s or 80s, when they were removed, when it became the society became more comfortable with engineers advertising. Competing by reducing charges, so this forbids underbidding. Underbidding under what you actually will have to bid, that's a form of falsity. So when there's a job and you're saying how much it'll cost the client for you to do this job, that kind of underbidding, if you say less than you know that you're going to ask for later, that kind of underbidding is wrong, and we'll see it forbidden in many of these codes of ethics. But this is just saying you can't say, I'll charge less than the other guy, even if you really will charge less. So this is fascinating. What we don't see in this code is anything about protecting the public. 1946, moving along. The NSPE approves Code of Ethics for Engineers. And here we have from the preamble, honesty, justice, and courtesy form a moral philosophy, which, associated with mutual interest among men, constitutes the foundation of ethics. The engineer should recognize such a standard, not in passive observance, but as a set of dynamic principles guiding his conduct and way of life. I love this, okay? You shouldn't just take the virtues, honesty, justice, courtesy. You shouldn't just take those as something to passively observe, but they should be dynamic principles guiding your conduct and way of life. I like the vision that you try and be a person of character that has an impact on the world around you by the character that you demonstrate. And here, this is totally moving in the right direction and moving in the same way that Leverich was advocating for in 1877. Here we have consideration of the public welfare put not as the first item on the list, but as a reasonably considerable item. He will have due regard for the safety and life and health of the public and employees who may be affected by the work he's responsible for, and he'll guard against conditions that are dangerous or threatening to life, limb, or property. These items in the code will become the first item in all of the current codes now in 2020. That the first thing to focus on is the good of the public. And in fact, as time has gone on, the engineer has been thought of as professionally beholden to the public before the client, beholden to the public before the employer. And that, though controversial, and perhaps mostly observed in the breach, it's hard to believe that most engineers working at ordinary aerospace or car companies or engineers working in all various walks of life, it's hard to believe that they really do put the public first. They might think a lot more carefully about things like the environment and long-term effects if they were putting the public first. But at least it's in the codes as being critical. 1954, the NSPE again creates its Board of Ethical Review. Really, the NSP is a superstar in this story. They put together the most admirable code early on in 9 years before this. They put together this Board of Ethical Review, and they maintain it all the way until now, where it continues. This is a board of individuals, engineers, and ethical experts, 7 members, who get questions brought to them by various engineers in the profession. So something comes up and they say, oh crap, I have an ethical dilemma here. I don't know what to do. I'm being asked to practice engineering in a state that I'm not permitted to, but if I fail to do this, it will be a danger to the public. What should I do? These sorts of questions arise. And the BER, that's the abbreviation they go by, the BER takes these cases and offers a response. The responses are kind of legalistic in their tone, but they're pretty interesting, and I'm going to have you looking at these later in the course. More timeline here, talking about adjustments to these codes or additional codes from 1964 on. So in 1964, the NSPE approves a code of ethics to replace the canon, the fundamental canons that they put together. And we see here in 3A something significant from this code that exists in all existing codes right now. Engineers shall be objective and truthful in professional reports, statements, or testimony. Truthfulness being very critical, at least in the codes. The question is, is that really practiced in the real world? And what are the consequences if it isn't? We'll be talking about that as the course goes on. But with this and the Board of Ethical Review, NSPE is showing leadership and has continued to show leadership throughout its history in the area of ethics. Now, from the 60s to the 1990s, the IEEE adjusted its code to have this classic line, which then the NSPE sort of parroted and imitated, that the first item on the code: we agree to hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public, to strive to comply with ethical design and sustainable development practices, to protect the privacy of others, and to disclose promptly factors that might endanger the public or the environment. The good of the public comes first. The good of the public comes first, that according to this IEEE code. Now, a parallel story is going on in a delayed form with computer ethics, which isn't surprising since computers weren't around in the 1870s or the 1950s, really, to much of a degree. So here we have three figures, two of them instructors from Old Dominion, who were teaching ethics classes while suddenly realizing that their students were involved in computers, and so they had to figure out how to apply ethical theories to computing, and that's not obvious. And James Moore, around 1980, wrote a seminal paper called "What is Computer Ethics?" And one of the things he says there is that when you have ethical problem with computers, the situation is very unique. There's not a lot of experience. There's not a lot of time-tested approaches, because computers give new capabilities that weren't there before. So, for example, with a computer, you suddenly have the ability to instantly transfer information, or to now ethical problem that arises these days is when we have a 3D printer. You suddenly have the ability for anyone who has CAD and a 3D printer to create a whole variety of objects that could only be manufactured by very specialized individuals before. How do you apply ethics to these situations? Well, you have to develop systems. You have to figure out how to apply old norms to new situations. So in 1992, the ACM, Association for Computing Machinery, which is not really a software association, we don't see any software associations that I'm familiar with that have brought out ethical norms and ethical codes of ethics. But the ACM approved a third version of their code of ethics, and this one actually applied more broadly to situations that it would include things like software, things like privacy, and things like the internet. Now, one of the things about this is that the need for more developed thinking about ethics when it comes to computers, when it comes to phones, when it comes to recording devices, when it comes to deep fakes, all these types of things. We desperately need more people thinking about this, more people creating codes about this, more people applying ethical theories about these things. Desperately need that. Now, here's the part in the story where what had seemed like a story of progress from year to year and decade to decade turns on its head. You see, IEEE, who had been providing advice to various engineers who wanted help with engineering problems through their hotline for decades, in the late 90s, their executive committee decided to undermine the ethics of their own members by terminating all ethical advice and support to members. The reason that was given for this was that they were worried about being sued because they would give some advice to some engineer to maybe resist what the company was telling them to do, and they were worried about getting a lawsuit filed against them by a big corporation or some such thing. This had never happened, but they were worried about it. So they terminated the ethics hotline, which was meant to provide immediate support for engineers seeking information, advice, or help regarding ethics-related problems. They said that they wouldn't be involved in employer-employee disputes, and they refused to even offer informal advice in any way, shape, or form. Basically, they align themselves with big money, I would put it. They align themselves with the forces that don't want change, that don't want to consider ethical reasons and the good of the public necessarily when making their decisions, which are often the decisions that are best for stockholders, but not necessarily best for the public. Now, thankfully, there's been some reversal on this, some level of reversal. As of 2017, the IEEE determined that the decisions to cease offering advice to engineers were actually lower level decisions that had been, prior to their even being made, had been superseded by higher level decisions. So there's like the organization has a sort of structure to its laws and its procedures. And so that these decisions to cease offering advice were never valid, were never justified by the grounding documents of the organization. Nevertheless, it happened that there was 20 years where no advice was being given. And in fact, it is still the case that IEEE has no mechanism, like the NSPE does, has no mechanism to get questions from individual electronics or electrical engineers. Some of that is including a good deal of computer ethics too. In this case, they have no mechanism from which to get questions and to answer them from their bases of expertise. And without any mechanism to do that, you can imagine that obviously it doesn't get done. And so the situation right now with engineering ethics is very fluid. It's very underdeveloped, I would say, with the exception of the NSPE. And in fact, as we'll talk about later in the course, there are very few consequences for engineers that fail to follow ethical guidelines in their practice. So I'm concerned about all those things. We will talk about all those things as the course goes on. After we have this some discussions about the Code of Ethics, we're going to return back and look at the history of ethics, and that'll be kind of like the more deeply philosophical or even literary portion of the course. But then we'll be pulling back into talking about how to apply these codes of ethics to practical situations in your daily job if you become an engineer or a computer scientist or a programmer. Okay, great. Thank you.